Hello anime fans, this is Trixie the Golden Witch. This video was available 1 week ago for my supporters on Backed by, Patreon, and Substack. Their contributions make these videos possible, so I can't thank them enough. Fantasy and science fiction are genres with long histories, and much to do has come of distinguishing the difference between them. Broadly, most people think of fantasy as meaning stuff that resembles Dungeons and Dragons, and science fiction as stuff resembling Star Trek. Much balk has come from deciding how hard the science in science fiction needs to be before it qualifies as part of the genre, and whether traditional fantasy adventures which happen to be set in space should have a name like space fantasy or science fantasy. You hear this most especially when people talk about Star Trek and Star Wars, as though there must be some reason to consider these series as part of different genres, even though way more insane and inexplicable shit happens in Star Trek, but it just stops to wax philosophically about it along the way. I think it's even more fair to consider both of these works as part of the same sci-fi lineage, with Star Wars having some clear influence from Star Trek's excellent realization of sci-fi imagery. But I also think that science fiction is such a broad category that it's even harder to find where something stops being called sci-fi and starts to be considered fantasy. Most of you know the quote about how any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. At the core of a lot of sci-fi and fantasy is essentially the attempt to explain how a slight tweak in the way that the universe functions or is understood would allow certain magics to change the way that everyone lives. How much a work resembles fantasy or science fiction in tone tends to come down to how much the work needs you to understand the functions of its magic. The Lord of the Rings qualifies as fantasy to me because its magic, while sometimes vaguely follows rules, is mostly inexplicable. The story feels logical more because of its sense of historicity than for obeying the natural laws of science. Tolkien was fundamentally a linguist, and he built his fantasy setting out of an attempt to realize a fictional language, from which he built a world in which multiple species of humanoids have developed their own languages based on the differences in the environment around which their populations evolved. Even though Star Wars is often considered science fantasy because of the Force being presented as a kind of magic, there was always an attempt to explain why that magic is possible and what are its limitations, even before the prequel series really went into the nitty-gritty with it. Star Wars doesn't take a lot of time to explain why most of its technology works in the way that Star Trek might have, but I think it's also fair to think that Star Wars was building on that groundwork of cultural knowledge about space that had been built through harder science fiction stories in order to skip the need to justify a lot of things which we could just understand because we already knew about it. I recently rewatched some episodes of Space Adventure Cobra, which follows a similarly chaotic, pulpy approach to sci-fi as what Star Wars does, and it also goes into a surprising amount of bullshit detail about how its most far-flung technologies work. There's always necessarily an aspect of fantasy to sci-fi because if it was limited to what we knew to be verifiably possible, it would simply be contemporary fiction. An aspect of the unproven, the theoretical, unidentified, and therefore magical is necessary to the genre. In this sense, I think it's not too surprising that sci-fi tends to have a lot more to say about magic than fantasy does, in which magic is often taken for granted as an incidental part of the setting. In my video about outer space anime, I posited that the growth of anime focused on outer space coincided with explosive economic growth in Japan, and also with the popularity of massive sci-fi franchises like Space Battleship Yamato, Star Wars, and Mobile Suit Gundam. The economic crash going into the 90s all but silenced space anime until creating them became part of exploring new technologies with animation in the early 2000s, only to be silenced once again after the 2008 global market crash and into the 2010s. But I don't think that this is because science fiction is no longer interesting to people, it's just the space. If anything, the information age has caused the genre to explode into mainstream success like never before. It's just that not a lot of it is focused on space. When anime about going into immersive video game worlds first started coming stateside when I was like 12 in 2003, I thought they were mind-blowingly cutting edge. Video games had only recently started depicting reality with enough realism to even resemble a place that one conceivably could go. But the thought of teleporting into the world of something like the 3D Final Fantasy games seemed incredible to me as a preteen. I watched all of Dot Hack Sign despite how bone-dry boring that show is, just because it took place inside of an MMORPG, and I was obsessed with the idea of those, but I didn't know how to get into one of them back then because I didn't have the computer literacy and there weren't a bunch of quick download, free to start games built into my console browser like there are now. Dot Hack and Mare, which is about the same type of thing, were ahead of their time, and so was Sword Art Online, which was written close enough to those that it must have come from the same zeitgeist of consciousness, but also was much too early for worldwide consciousness of gaming to progress to a level for stories about it to become successful. Until, of course, Sword Art Online was adapted to animation in 2012 and became one of the best performing animated series ever made. Now, SAO isn't widely considered isekai, and a lot of what it inspired now is called Nato-kei or Neto-kei instead. But what I really want to focus on is how SAO and the stuff that it inspired, under whatever name you like, caused the science fiction and fantasy genres to start bleeding together almost inseparably over the next 12 years of anime. Science fiction and fantasy are both genres with plenty of representation in video games, and video games are contemporary in concept, but video games so advanced that one might get trapped inside of one are still in the realm of science fiction, even if the setting of the game itself is a fantasy. In the same way that trying to explain how the magic works in Space Cobra or Star Wars gives those the impression of science fiction instead of fantasy, using video game mechanics to explain why everything functions in the way that it does inside of a fantasy setting slowly turns it more into sci-fi from an alternate historical setting than just fantasy. Now that we're on the other side of a few hundred shows about people going into video game worlds or alternate realities which function based on the logic of video games, there has now been a surge in what is mimetically described as native isekai, fantasy shows whose internal logic is so heavily couched in video game references that it's easy to forget that it's not actually set inside of a video game. Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon really kicked off this trend to me, but what I saw of that show was a lot more on the fantasy adventure side than even the stuff that's ostensibly less video game derived, like the recent Sousou no Frieren series. Frieren is explicitly about magic being treated as science. Frieren herself is functionally an immortal scientist with all the time in the world to run experiments and search for advancements in order to transcribe and describe magical functions. It's not that a scientific approach to magic hasn't been popular in especially contemporary fantasy, like all the magical high school shows that cribbed from Harry Potter, but even those are a lot less dedicated to regarding magic as a logical aspect of the universe that must be justified and whose function must be described within the story, as compared to Frieren. It could be argued that video games simply did this to fantasy without considering isekai as an intermediary, but I think where anime's had an advantage in terms of cultural influence is in its turnaround speed, not to mention the incestuousness of a medium which borrows even more from itself than anything else, though games are a close second. RPGs don't usually try to justify their mechanics narratively in the story, but anime doesn't really have the opportunity to break away and offer a tutorial about game mechanics without inventing a character who can literally do that, or creating a metatextual divorce between one character's understanding of reality and everyone else's, which justifies them having everything about the world explained to them. Anime set in video game worlds didn't used to concern themselves with how that world functioned mechanically as a game, but isekai stories often functionally double as a pitch for a cool idea someone's had for a JRPG mechanic. In a way, it was inevitable that shows were going to start skipping the middleman and just take a science fiction approach to telling a story in a world with fantasy aesthetics, cause it's cool. I would even say that my light novel, Kusomega, does something kind of similar. Do you think fantasy anime is turning into science fiction, or am I overthinking it? How do you feel about this change if you think I'm onto something? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe and ring the bell if you want more of my content, and always remember, anime forever.
I've been cruising along this life. When I get hungry, I just bite.